Hello. Thank you, Eddie, and the Video Club of Winmore for having me as a guest to discuss basically anti-Semitism and our book, Not a Real Enemy, The True Story of a Hungarian Jewish Man's Fight for Freedom. I'm Rob Wolf. I'm a retired radiologist. I've been working in the radiology field for 35 years, 44 years all in when you consider college and medical school. Raised in Michigan, half my life in Michigan, half my life in New England, and now I've been here in southern Florida in Winmore for about 7 years. After medicine, my vector changed, and I realized how rising anti-Semitism was an issue, especially now. And so I was motivated to write this book about my father. I turned his autobiography into a biography, multiple edits, but it's a biography about my dad. It's a history book about little-known Hungary from the end of World War I to the end of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which few people know about, including myself, until I delved into this project. It's the tragedies and triumphs of my dad's family, friends, and colleagues, and it's an adventure. The book has won 4 awards, which is a miracle in itself. My dad was a 4-time escape artist, and there are at least 20 miracles in this book. Cloak and dagger stories, multiple miracles. So I was motivated, and let me tell you about what the book brought out in me, my emotions, my feelings, and this is what I tell people when we do book presentations. When I was growing up in Michigan in the 60s and 70s, I couldn't comprehend my parents as having lives before I was born. I knew they'd come from Hungary, and I knew they'd fled Europe after the war, and that my dad's parents had been killed, but Hungary seemed as far away as World War II, and I didn't have much interest. As I grew, I came to learn about the Holocaust, and I knew it was horrible, and I knew my parents had been right in the middle of it. But still, that was a world so abstract to me that I couldn't comprehend it, so I didn't. My parents never talked about the younger lives that much. My mother, Judith, was a homemaker, happy to cook and care for me, and devoted her life to her family. And of course, religious organizations such as ORT and our Temple Sisterhood, while educating people about history and the Holocaust. I couldn't imagine her having a life outside her family. As for my father, Irvin Wolf, he was a joyful, enthusiastic, energized, and charismatic guy. I knew he was clever. After all, he was a doctor. And as a respected obstetrician, all I could imagine of my dad was his life devoted to bringing life into the world. Their lives before my birth hadn't really impacted me, not until I was grown and my dad began to tell me more about what happened in those wartime years. It was only then that the horrors of the Holocaust went from a history lesson that my parents had survived to a shocking realization of just what had truly happened to them. Far worse, I began to realize the devastating truth of how my grandparents had risen to a life of wealth and great social respect, only to be brutally murdered by the Nazis for the crime of being Jewish. Yet, as my father revealed a story to me, which my parents and I recorded over many years, as I listened and took detailed notes, what struck me beyond the tragedy was how inspiring and miraculous his story turned out to be. The congenial and witty doctor that I knew was not the ordinary man I thought my father to be. He was a man who had outwitted the Nazis, escaping from their imprisonment not once, but twice, a man who endured unspeakable loss, who survived on his wits while hiding out in a series of secret buildings and secret rooms, who engaged in outlandish adventures, and then, when he thought it was all over and he could finally live as a free man at last, the communists took over, and he found himself engaged in a series of cloak and dagger escapes and escapades as he set out to escape Europe once and for all. In my book, Not a Real Enemy, The True Story of a Hungarian Jewish Man's Fight for Freedom, I tell my father's story. I don't want to give too much away because I hope you'll read about his journey and find it as amazing as I did, but I do want to talk about some of the feelings the story inspired. The first is loneliness. We all know what it is to feel alone, even when surrounded by others. I can't imagine how lonely my dad must have felt when he was forced to leave his family at the age of 21. He never even spent a night without them, and after his first escape from the forced labor camp, after a long and clumsy all-out foot race for his own freedom, forced to hide for hours in the cold and wintry thicket of the Caspian foothills, I have no doubt my dad was scared and lonely. He was just a kid who knew that he'd be killed if he was caught, and so he risked being eaten alive by bears or wolves rather than risk another night of the guards' brutality. Yet loneliness was something he knew well. As he was growing up in Hungary, an only child, he was bullied for being a Jew, for not being Jewish enough when he lived among the Orthodox, for living in the wrong neighborhood, for not fitting in. Let me read to you an excerpt from the book when my father has just arrived at the labor camp and recognizes a friend from school. Thank God for Frank, Irvin thought. He never needed anyone like he felt he needed Frank at the moment. Frank would not just be a familiar face in the midst of this horrible ordeal. His common sense and leadership was just the thing Irvin needed now that he was under the control of these brutes. A friend like Frank could help him get through it, he was certain. The question was, what did he have to offer Frank besides mere friendship? He prayed he'd find the answer, because in that flicker of a second in which he recognized Frank's face through the stable's darkness, the intensity of his need for just such a friend swept over him. I'll be damned, Irvin called out to his old friend, Frank Moore. Come here, I've got something for you. And with that, he unwrapped all he had to offer, a few crescent cookies and some cold pierogies. It wasn't much, but in that cold and lonely moment in a stable built for livestock, it was the most generous gift Irvin could provide to the friend who gave him more than mere camaraderie. Having Frank beside him gave him hope he would survive. After the war, the communists watched his every move, listened in on his private conversations, monitored his movements, imprisoned his friends and colleagues, turning one against the other, recruiting spies among his fellow medical students, and then among his colleagues. He learned to remain silent. Even after marrying my mother, who was herself a medical student, they were forced into a solitude together. No one could be trusted, yet no one could survive alone. One lesson I learned from my father was that loneliness is a part of the human condition, but it needn't mark us as outsiders. We must depend on others, even as we do so with caution. Our loneliness is an existential state, but ultimately we are inextricably linked to the lives and fates of others, and importantly, we are ultimately never alone. God is by our side every step of the way, even in our most isolating moments. Another feeling my father's story brings up is humiliation. Day by day, the indignities my dad, his family, and friends endured mounted. They were told where to stand and how to stand, where to live and how to live, denied the right to own a radio, denied the right to practice medicine, denied the right to work. For my father's fathers, these humiliations came after years of struggle to become a doctor, to acquire wealth, to raise his family in a grand home where they were all well respected. But no sooner had he achieved these honors that they were chipped away. First he was told he couldn't practice medicine, so he became a dentist. Then he was told he could not work, that his son must be sent to hard labor, that he could not mix with Gentiles, and that he must wear that ridiculous yellow star, marking him as unworthy, and ultimately that he could not live. My father's own humiliations mounted, but he would not let his humiliations define him. He refused to embrace the identity the Nazis and later the communists tried to impose upon him. Each of us has endured our own humiliations, and yet how they pale in comparison to what our Jewish ancestors endured. How much stronger we become when we accept our humiliation as a test of our endurance, of our own sense of who we are and our place in society. Only by forging our own identities do we cast off those identities others may confer upon us. Here's another excerpt from a scene in the labor camp where my father had been subjected to repeated humiliations and abuse. Though the men had hoped that over time the guards would be kinder to them, once they got to know them and saw them as fellow men, the opposite proved true. It was as if the more the guards came to know the men, the more emboldened they became to abuse them, perhaps because they had learned that no act, no matter how brutal, would be punished, whereas any kindness they showed would be. Whatever the cause, the guards delighted in their cruelty. When the men were working in the deep wells, the guards would amuse themselves by urinating on them, turning the holes they dug into veritable latrines. Yet the humiliation didn't bother the men so much because the more they were peed on, the more satisfied the guards were that they inflicted sufficient degradation on their charges, thereby lessening the chance of a beating. It was the beatings the men most feared. There's also the theme of integrity, which is alive on every page. My father would never have survived had he not had integrity. Throughout the book, my father's integrity, and that of several others, proves to be the saving grace that kept him and others alive. My grandfather, as well, proved to be a man of integrity, and many scenes show how his integrity, which in the end could not save him, nor my grandmother, saved the life of his son, if not directly, then indirectly by how he had raised my father. When Dad had been sent to labor service, my grandparents were worried that he would not survive because they'd been so spoiled, had no experience with hard work. But they underestimated how far integrity would take Irvin, who came to realize that it wasn't just his own life that was at stake, but that of his friends and fellow prisoners. His determination that no one would die because of his actions, his failures, or his mistakes compelled my father to find the strength to carry on, to work harder, and to rise above the horror. Because of his integrity, others learned to trust my dad, and because of the integrity of others, he survived. In our world today, it's easier to despair. But I'll bet there's not one of you who hasn't been blessed by the integrity of another, who hasn't demonstrated your own integrity when it most mattered. Learning my father's story inspired me to always act with integrity and to live up to his own high standards of how we treat others and ourselves. Another excerpt. As they reached the town center, the men noticed masses of marching military columns, occasionally interrupted by armored trucks or horse-drawn wagons. The striking difference between the two, one a symbol of power and might and igniting fear in the hearts of the men, the other a symbol of simplicity and self-reliance, conjuring peace and safety. If not a world before the war, caused the men to reassess whether they ought to be so bold as to approach anyone at all. The alternative is we become thieves just to eat, Irvin said, and I'd rather bank on people having a good heart than darkening my own. I'm with you, Frank said, as he was a man of integrity himself, but we need to be careful. Agreed, Irvin said, just as a couple of well-dressed men came out of a building they were passing. Good afternoon, soldiers, one of the men said, tipping his hat. The other did the same, and no sooner had Irvin and Frank returned the greeting than one of the men asked, "What brings you to our town? We don't have many soldiers out here other than those trucks and tanks that pass us by." Irvin gave them their cover story, which promptly brought more questioning. The more he answered their questions, Frank stepping back and keeping conspicuously quiet so as not to contradict or confuse the explanation, the more nervous Irvin became. What had become a friendly greeting was quickly advancing to a suspicious interrogation. "Look," the man, the more vocal one, said in a lowered tone, stepping away from the street and closer to the building as if it was a safer place to be, away from the passers-by. "No one gets lost out here. You're Jews, and you've made a run for it." Finally, there's hope. My father was a soft-spoiled only child who hadn't done a lick of work in his life. He didn't even have to make his own bed. There was a maid to do that. When he was sent to the Nazi-controlled labor service, a brutal work camp for Jews who were considered too inferior for national service and only fit for the most arduous, unpleasant tasks, like digging deep ditches in the dead of winter, laying the ground for an airport strip with their bare hands, marching across the country in scorching heat or icy winters, all with barely enough food to keep them alive. Another excerpt. As time went on, small graces helped the men to endure the realities of their fate. Irvin learned that from Mike's father, who inexplicably was allowed a rare visit and brought news from the outside world, that the guards could be bribed. Though the guards never spoke directly to the men unless it was to deliver orders or rebukes, and never looked them in the eye, through small acts of bribery a silent contract had developed. Some young men received a bit more food, a few less punishments, even extra clothing. Fortunately, it wasn't long before Irvin learned that his own father had met with the guards offering free dental treatment for their families as well as cash, and Irvin received a visit from one of the guards not long after. "Wolf!" Irvin sprang to attention, ready to withstand whatever was coming. He looked up and saw Janos, the guard who'd served them sausages at the earlier camp, jerk his head for Irvin to come to him. Irvin complied, standing at attention before the funny-looking man. Janos had tiny eyes buried in a face so pockmarked he looked almost like a burn victim. He was quite hideous, but Irvin concluded it may have been his ugliness which rendered him more sympathetic than the other guards. Still, he was a guard, and Irvin had long since concluded that even the kindest of guards held power over him, and no one holds power without employing it. Thus, when Janos commanded Irvin to approach, Irvin was as cautious as he was obedient. "Your parents want you to have this," he said, his voice low and neither kind nor cruel. He handed Irvin a small paper packet as discreetly as if he were passing a valet a well-earned tip, and then turned and barked orders to a nearby group of men. Irvin used the diversion to sneak back to his bunk and open the packet. Inside was a chain of gold with a simple four-leaf clover charm, a small ruby embedded in the center. Irvin had never before received jewelry from his parents, but this golden four-leaf clover was the most treasured gift he'd ever opened, not for it being gold, a symbol of their optimism and hope that he'd be home soon. He turned the charm over and saw that they'd had the charm engraved. In remembrance from your parents, 1943 X4. A tear fell from Irvin's face, followed by another, then another. 1943, the year he had last seen his family. X was the Roman numeral for the month of October, and 4 for the day he'd departed just a few months earlier. The tears fell heavily now as he realized how momentous that day had been, and how much that date was etched not just upon the golden charm, but upon his parents' hearts. Coincidentally, or possibly not, my bar mitzvah was on October 4th, 32 years later. The despair my father and his fellow laborers felt was palpable, but in the midst of that despair, deep and lasting bonds were formed with his friends and fellow prisoners, and small tokens like a simple kindness, a shared bit of food, a funny story late at night, brought the comfort and glimmer of hope that they needed to endure the unendurable. In these troubled times in our own nation, times that in some ways echo the early days of the rise of fascism, and in other ways don't even come close, we would do well to embrace that hope. We live surrounded by comforts and kindness, yet how easily we lose sight of all that we have. Reading stories like that of my father can teach us to find hope in the darkest moments. For my father, hope kept him alive when he felt dead. Hope kept him going, giving him the courage he needed to dare his most dangerous escapes, and hope gave him the certainty that his pain would pass. We are living in troubling times, and the rise of anti-Semitism in our nation and across the globe is shockingly great. Whether the rise of anti-Semitism or the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 that my father quite literally stumbled upon as he made his way home, the lessons of the past are alive and with us. Let's think about these lessons as we live our lives in freedom. I do hope that you'll read my father's story, because I have no doubt that you'll find in his story the same inspiration that he brought to me. Inspire me to never give up hope, to live a life of integrity, to never let anyone else shame or define me, and to never forget that while life comes with tragedies, some so great that they are unspeakable, our future is our own to make. I'd like to tell you that once the Nazis were gone, Irvin's life got better, and though he did get into medical school finally, and did find employment as an obstetrician, life under the communists proved to be another challenge. There's a saying, the crocodiles have gone, but the alligators have arrived. And I think that pretty much sums up what was going on in Hungary during those years. Dad even paraphrased, out of the frying pan into the fire. One only needs to look at Ukraine to realize that things haven't changed much, eh? In closing, I'd like to leave you these thoughts. Although few people know the story of what happened to the Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust, nearly 500,000 were deported, as my grandparents were, most going straight to Auschwitz where they were killed. Almost all who survived were the ones like my father who were serving in the deplorable labor camps where beatings, starvation, and death marches were common. In Not a Real Enemy, I've tried to tell the story of the Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust and their fate under Stalin's communism. Every Jew who lived there during those times has their own story to tell, and this is just one among the over 825,000 Jews who lived in Hungary prior to the war. As my father's story shows, there are fine lines between good and evil, war and peace, love and hate, hope and despair, tolerance and prejudice, right and wrong. I wish that the lines were much thicker rather than so fine, but I am immensely proud to know where my family stood. Through all those harrowing years, my father exhibited immeasurable determination to not only survive against steep odds, but once he had survived such unspeakable atrocities, once he learned of his parents' fates and the fates of so many other people he cared about, either during the reign of the Nazis or the reign of the communists, Dad was determined not to be destroyed. The very fact of his survival became a pledge to God and to the memory of his parents to fully live his life. When I started out this journey 8 years ago, I had no idea what I was getting into, despite the many stories that my parents shared with me and others. And I do hope that I've done their story and history justice. And I do hope that you'll enjoy the book and share your thoughts with me. I want my father's story to do more than entertain you. I want it to inspire you in these difficult times so that you will know, just as my father came to know, that you are stronger than you realize, and our nation is as well. Thank you so much for your attention. You can reach me at robertjwolfmd.com, YouTube channel, Not a Real Enemy by Robert Wolf. I've got a website, robertjwolfmd.com, I mentioned, and I'm in Winmore. You can find me pretty easily, and Google Not a Real Enemy or Robert J. Wolf MD, and feedback welcome. Thank you, Eddie, and the Video Club of Winmore. Appreciate the time, and thanks for having me. and to better times.